Welcome to Gospel Truth with Andrew Wommack, a teaching ministry that focuses on God's unconditional love and grace.
It's like he was just putting the pieces together for me in such a way that just was simple but powerful. And I was like, yeah, this is God's truth right here.
It wasn't always what I wanted to hear, but I knew it was the truth, and I always wanted the truth.
And now, here's Andrew.
Welcome to our Monday's broadcast of the Gospel Truth. Today is my fourth and final week to be teaching on the keys to staying full of God. I tell you, I've really enjoyed this. This is something that is a working reality in my life. And I can't take credit for all of it. I've been seeking the Lord, but this is just something that God showed me way back in the beginning of my walk with the Lord. And because of it, I've been able to keep my joy and keep my focus on the Lord. I haven't gone through periods of turning away from the Lord and stuff. And yet this is the average experience for most people, is that they're up and down like a yo-yo. They can't maintain the same intensity, the same joy, the same peace. And I tell you, I'm just not that way. And it's because of these truths that God has shown me. And so I'm excited about sharing this with you. And like I said, this is my fourth week to be doing this. And this week I'm offering an additional offer about hardness of heart. Now this is kind of a negative title. I actually had Bob Yandian, who's a very good friend of mine. He heard me preach this over in England and he got blessed by it. He said he straightened it out, fixed it, and then he put out a book by the title of The Power of an Established Heart. And he says that's a positive title and hardness of heart's a negative title. This is just the way it came to me. So it may not sound good, but this is what we're going to be talking about all of this week. It says in Romans chapter 1 and in verse 21, it's talking about that everyone has an intuitive knowledge of God. At one time, they knew that there was a God, even His eternal power and Godhead. But there's things you can do to walk away from that and to deaden yourself to the voice of God and to the benefit of God in your life. And here's the four things that it says that you do. Because that when they knew God, they glorified Him not as God. That means they didn't value and esteem and prize God and the revelation He had given them the way that they should. The second thing, it says they weren't thankful. And man, we talked about that. Thankfulness magnifies things. If you focus on what God has done and if you're thankful for the good, that magnifies this and makes God bigger in your life. But if you aren't thankful, well then that means that you're magnifying the problems. You're magnifying what the devil is doing. And you're magnifying your grief and your sorrow. So you have to put the proper value on God. You have to focus on Him through thanksgiving. And what I dealt with all last week was it says that they became vain in their imaginations. And I was saying that if you put the proper value, if you really value God and what He's done in your life, if you constantly are thankful and reminding yourself of His goodness to you, it will cause your imagination to work in a positive way, which the Bible calls hope. You will have hope, and hope makes not ashamed because the love of God gets shed abroad in your heart when you're operating in hope. That's out of Romans chapter 5. And so if you do those three things, then it goes on to say here that your heart becomes, well, in the negative here in verse 21, it says their foolish heart was darkened. And I'm turning this around and saying if you will do the opposite of these people who are walking away from the Lord, and if you will glorify God, be thankful, use your imagination in a positive way to cause hope, then your heart won't become darkened. You won't have a foolish heart, but you'll have a sensitive heart. And man, again, I'm going through some things very quickly because this little teaching that I've got right here on hardness of heart, I spent 4 weeks teaching on this, and I'm only going to spend 1 week this week discussing this. So I'm not going into the depth that I would if you want to get that book. But your heart is where all of the issues of life come from. This is what it says in Proverbs chapter 4. Keep your heart with all diligence, for out of it are the issues of life. The average person, even the average Christian, doesn't totally understand this. They think that it's all about your environment, about the way you were brought up, about what happens to you, and they look at things on the outside and think that this is what makes this person the way they are. That's not true. All of us have bad things happen, but not everybody becomes bitter because of that. You can become better. It's all a decision of the heart. The way that you think in your heart is the way it's going to be. Proverbs 23:7 says, "For as he thinketh in his heart, so is he." Your life is going the direction of your heart. And I know that there's people watching this who think that's not so, because I want prosperity, I want healing, I want joy, I want a good marriage, and none of those things are happening. I'm not saying that it's going the direction of your desires. It's going the direction of the way that your heart is established. You can fix your heart. You can establish your heart so that regardless of what happens to you on the outside, you are consistent with the Lord. And I know that there's some people thinking that's just not so. I am totally a product of what other people are doing. It's other people that have treated me badly. I could go and show you examples of people that have had every negative thing that have happened to you happen to them, and yet they didn't cave through it. Yes, I'm not saying that natural things aren't an issue, but it's not the determining issue. It's the way you establish your heart. As your heart goes, that's the way that your life is going to go. Let me use this passage out of Ephesians. And this is in chapter 4. And I tell you, I've got about a dozen of my teachings that are pretty much based on Ephesians chapter 4. But here in Ephesians chapter 4, verse 17, it says, "This I say therefore, and testify in the Lord, that ye henceforth walk not as other Gentiles walk, in the vanity of their mind." And the word vanity here means the inutility and transientness. Inutility just means you aren't using it properly. You're just letting hormones drive you, lust, desires. You're like a pinball and you're just bouncing off of life's obstacles, and it just depends on what happens to you. It says don't be like a person that doesn't know the Lord and that doesn't have a guidance system on the inside, and you just walk in the inutility of your mind. Start using your mind. And specifically in context of what we've been talking about, start using your imagination. Put worth and value on God. Be thankful. Focus on what He's done, and your imagination will chart a course for you of hope. And you do that, that's awesome. It says don't be like a person who walks in the vanity of their mind. And then another word for vanity, it means the transientness. Transient just means that you aren't focused. And this is where so many people are. We've got so many things vying for our attention today. Man, we've got cell phones now that I've seen statistics that the average person spends up to 4 or 5 hours a day on their cell phone. This used to be time that you had to either think or to read or to study or to interact with people, but now it's just sitting here, getting all of this, most of it's useless information. It's amazing how we have so many things vying for our attention, and so it says don't walk in the transientness of your mind. You need to be focused. The Apostle Paul said in Philippians chapter 3, "This one thing I do." One thing. Today, people multitask and they take great pride in it, and they're just doing multiple things. Paul said the key to victory, the key to his success is this one thing I do. You know, I'm at a stage in my life where God has blessed our ministry. We've got it's just awesome, the opportunity we have, and we've got a cash flow now that I could be doing all kinds of things. And I've had people say, why don't you start orphanages? Why don't you support these, why don't you start a ministry to get, these people out of sex trade, these young people and things like that? And why don't you do this and that? And I support people who do all of those things. But you know what? I've learned that for me to prosper and to finish my course and cross the finish line in good health, I need to do what God called me to do. And just because it's good doesn't mean it's God. I've got to do what God called me to do. This one thing I do, I know what God's will for my life is. I know what He's called me to do, and that's what I focus on. And I will send money and help other people. I'm for those things. But I've got to do what God called me to do. Man, that's what it's talking about when it's saying don't walk in the vanity of your mind, the inutility and the transientness of your mind. If you were walking in the vanity of your mind, if you weren't utilizing your mind, if you're letting circumstances, feelings, emotions control you, if you aren't focused on the things of God, then you will have your understanding darkened. Now see, this goes right along with Romans chapter 1, where it talks about their foolish heart was darkened. And this uses the term understanding. And the actual Greek word for this is dianoia, and it means deep thought. There's a difference in just surface thoughts and then deep thoughts. You know, sometimes you have to ponder things to truly understand. Matter of fact, over in Proverbs chapter 4, it says, ponder the path of your feet and let all of your ways be established. If people would sit down and use their head for something besides a hat rack, and if they would think about where their life is going and stuff, it would change the way they live. For instance, a person who's on drugs, if they would think about where this is going to lead them. Do they want the expense? Man, there's people that have just destroyed fortunes. They've destroyed their life. They've destroyed families because of the expense of their drugs. It destroys their health. It puts them in all of these things. If people would sit down and think, and if their understanding wasn't darkened, I guarantee you people wouldn't take that stuff. There's a reason they call that stuff dope. Amen. You are a dope. I'm saying this in love, but you are a dope if you are on narcotics and stuff like this. It's just damaging. But this is saying that don't be like a person who doesn't know the Lord, and you aren't using your mind, you aren't focused on the things of God, your understanding is darkened. And see this over in Romans chapter 1. This is a progression, and it's an end result of not glorifying God, not really valuing God in your life, not putting Him first place. You aren't thankful, you aren't focused on what God is doing, but instead you're looking at all of the negative things that are happening and things like this. And because you're negative in those first two areas, then your imagination, it moves from hope into despair. And you just see all of the negative things. And when that happens, then your heart becomes hardened. It becomes darkened. It gets to where your understanding isn't working. This deep thought is not working. So again, in verse 18, it says, having the understanding darkened, being alienated from the life of God through the ignorance that is in them because of the blindness of their heart. So again, this is saying that you're alienated from the life of God. Man, that's a strong word. Alienated means that there is no connection with the things of God. When you refer to an alien, in these sci-fi things, they're people that aren't from this world. They aren't of this world. When you are alienated, you aren't of God's kingdom. You are just trapped in this physical life. And all of this comes because you aren't glorifying God, you aren't being thankful, your imagination is turned from hope to despair, and it just causes your heart, your foolish heart, to become darkened, blinded. You can't see the light of God. You're alienated from the promises of God because of the blindness of your heart. And in verse 19 it says, who being past feeling have given themselves over unto lasciviousness to work all uncleanness with greediness. So again, this is just a progression of things. And what I'm going to be talking about all of this week is going back to Romans chapter 1. The fourth step in walking away from God is that your foolish heart becomes darkened. And I'm going to be talking about that we are the ones that control whether our heart is sensitive to God or whether it's hardened towards God. God doesn't control that, and circumstances don't control it. Circumstances influence it, but you have the deciding vote on whether what happens to you makes you bitter or better. You are not just a product of your environment. It depends on how you react to things. Let me share with you the way that the Lord began to teach me about this, about your heart and how important it is. And this is out of Mark chapter 6. And in the first part of the chapter is where God fed the 5,000 people. It says there were 5,000 men. There's bound to have been women and children there. So it's probably at least 10,000 people or 15,000 people. And He fed them with a very small amount of food. And then right after that, He constrained His disciples to get into a ship and go before Him to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, and He stayed on the seashore. And then in the middle of the night, it's normally a 2 to 3 hour trip across the Sea of Galilee. I've been there. I've been on a boat. It's not that big, and you can cross that Sea of Galilee in a couple of hours normally. But they left at sundown, and in the fourth watch of the night, that means that it was between 3 and 6 a.m., they were still only halfway across because the wind was contrary to them. And they were in a situation where the boat was now full of water. It looked like they might drown. And in the midst of their dilemma, here comes Jesus just walking on top of the water. Man, I love this because Jesus was just out for a stroll on top of the very thing that was about to kill them. And this is the way it is. You know, sometimes we think that God, this is even hard for God. Nothing is hard for God. The very thing that was killing them, it was just, an evening stroll for Jesus. And it says that He would have passed by His disciples. There's a great lesson in that. That if you're in a crisis situation, yes, the Lord is there to help you. He's on top of the very thing that's about to kill you, but He would pass by. He doesn't come and force Himself upon you. If this would have been one of us, and if I was the person and if I had the ability to walk on water, and if I saw my disciples, looks like they were going to drown, and I'm the one who compelled them to go out there against their own desires, and I was responsible, and if I came to save them, man, I'd be walking on the water, waving my arms and saying, hold on, I'm coming, and I'd come to rescue them. Jesus just walked close to him. They saw Him, and it says that He would have passed by them. In other words, God is there, but you have to make a demand. You have to tap in to His power. It doesn't work automatically. And many Christians just think, well, if God was really for me, then why did He let this happen? It may be because He was there, but you didn't call out to Him. You just kept occupied with what was bothering you, and you didn't place a demand on His ability and power. God doesn't force Himself upon you. So Jesus came walking, and this same thing is recorded in Matthew chapter 14. I'm not going to take time to turn over and read it there, but that's where Peter got out of the boat, and Peter walked on the water to go to Jesus. And so it's amazing to me that Mark and John didn't include that when they told this story, but only Matthew records that part. And so let me just read some of this to you in Mark chapter 6, verse 45. And straightway He constrained His disciples to get into the ship and go to the other side before unto Bethsaida, while He sent away the people. And when He had sent them away, He departed into a mountain to pray. And when even was come, the ship was in the midst of the sea, and He alone on the land. And He saw them toiling and rowing, for the wind was contrary unto them. And about the fourth watch of the night He cometh unto them, walking upon the sea, and would have passed by them. But when they saw Him walking upon the sea, they supposed it had been a spirit, and cried out, for they all saw Him and were troubled. And immediately He talketh with them, and saith unto them, Be of good cheer, it is I, be not afraid. Let me just interject this before we finish the rest of this story. But if all He wanted them to do was to be of good cheer and not be afraid, He could have just stilled the storm, solved their problem, and wouldn't that have cheered them up? See, that's the way most people look at it. But God has to use faith on our part. He can't come and just solve your problems without you. And I know some people take offense at that, and they think God can do anything He wants to. Ephesians chapter 3, verse 20 says, Now unto Him who is able to do exceeding abundantly above all we ask or think, according to the power that works in us. If you don't have any power of faith or love working in you, then it stops the power of God. I guess you could say God could do whatever He wants to, but He won't do it. He will not violate His word, and He is going to operate in your life according to the power that works in you. So that's the reason He told His disciples to be of good cheer, be not afraid. The reason He tried to calm them down is because He needed some positive response from them instead of just total panic and fear. If all he wanted to do is cheer them up, he could have stilled the storm. But see, that's not the way he works. He has to have a response of faith, some degree of faith on our part. So he told them to be of good cheer. And then in verse 51, it says, he went up unto them into the ship, and the wind ceased, and they were sore amazed in themselves beyond measure, and wondered, for they considered not the miracle of the loaves, for their heart was hardened. You know, I never will forget the very first time that this just jumped off the page at me and God spoke to me through this. I was flying in an airplane over the Great Lakes, headed to Chicago, and I read this, and you know, sometimes when you read the scripture, your mind may be wandering and you aren't really paying attention. Other times you're just totally there, focused on this. And I mean, I was thinking about this and I was seeing this happen. And I remember when I just saw myself like one of these disciples. What would it have been like to see Jesus walk on top of the very thing that's killing you? It's no big deal to him. And then he comes into the boat, and if you read this same thing over in John's gospel, it says that when Jesus entered into the boat, that the boat and the disciples and everything were just translated to the other side of the lake. And so I was putting all this together, and I was just overwhelmed. And when I read here that it says in verse 51, he says, he went up unto them into the ship, and the wind ceased, and they were sore amazed in themselves beyond measure, and wondered. And when I read that, I was exactly that same way. I was sore amazed. I was just overwhelmed. And I remember looking out the window of the airplane, and I saw the wing there, and it was just total clouds down below us. And I just thought, I said, it wouldn't be any more impossible to see Jesus walking on those clouds than it was to walk on water. And I just started imagining that. And I was feeling really good about being sore amazed in myself beyond measure and wonder. And then I read the next verse, and it says the reason they were like that is because they considered not the miracle of the loaves, for their heart was hardened. And this scripture is saying the reason they were shocked to see Jesus on top of the very thing that was killing them was because they had a hardened heart. And man, that rocked my world, because I thought a hard-hearted person was a person who hated God, a rapist, a murderer, a liar, stealer, theft, or a thief, or something like that. And that's what I was thinking of. But this says that if you are shocked to see the supernatural power of God, it's because you've got a hardened heart. And when I saw that, man, that just overwhelmed me. And it started me on about a 2 or 3 year search of what is a hardened heart? What does it do? How do you overcome it? And that's what I want to share with you this week. I'm giving you a condensed version of this teaching that I have entitled Hardness of Heart. This is a special offer this week only, and I encourage you to please get this. It'll be a supplement to what I'm teaching. And then the teaching that I've been doing for 4 weeks is in this book entitled Discover the Keys to Staying Full of God. And I tell you, this has really touched my life, and it's touched a lot of other people. I believe it would be a blessing for you, and it would give stability to your life. So listen to our announcer as he gives you the information, and please call or write today.